So Dan just told me what his ideal introduction would be. It is, that guy's Dan and he does education policy. So I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to make you suffer through something only marginally longer than that, but not hugely long enough to sort of describe all the great things Dan has done. So as most of you know, Dan is the director of the Center on Education Data and Research. He's also a research professor at the University of Washington, Bothell. And Dan has had a long history. Many of you may not know Dan started, I think, his career in Virginia at CNA and went to the Urban Institute, was there for several years before heading out to the West Coast. So I knew Dan from those early days, and Dan invariably always has done research that asks interesting questions. He's applied really useful insights, and this work has always had sort of great uptake in terms of policy relevance. And Dan and his work, I think, have been very important all the way from the highest levels of federal government in terms of education policy. And Dan and I were talking yesterday, but I think he really enjoys interacting with folks at school districts and at states where much of this policy actually gets done. I think he also has important influence there as well. So it's really wonderful to have Dan here for a day and a half, I think, all together. And Dan's doing some interesting work that relates to issues around teacher preparation. And so I'm just going to pass it to Dan and have him take over.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And it's from my perspective, it's been a great day and a half to hang out with Jim for several hours yesterday, walking around and meet people today and get a chance to visit them. So I thank you. I also just want to say one other thing, which Jim, you may not remember, but when I was in graduate school, part of my dissertation was using data from New York State, and some graduate student emailed Jim back when he was at SUNY Albany, and you helped me get access to some of the New York data way back then. So thank you. So my understanding of it, what do you call the Monday Lab?
Well,
what's this thing called?
Today is not Policy Lab. Today is the Research Lectures.
Okay, well, in the spirit of Policy Lab, as I understand it, the way Policy Lab sort of works is that people are presenting ideas, and you can say, hey, that's cool, or you might want to rethink things, or no, you may think about something else. I would like to present this work in that spirit. This is a kind of early work. There's some of it which is coherent or semi-coherent, and there's actually a paper which is down here at the bottom. If you just go to the Senior website, you can find it, that talks about some of what I would present today. I'll tell you a little bit more about where we're going, and it is a we. So this is work that is going with John Krieg, who is up at Western Washington University, and Roddy Theobald, who's a research assistant in my center, who is terrific, and will be out on the market before too long. Okay, so the title of the presentation, Knocking at the Door of the Teaching Profession, basically in what I'm going to talk about today, we're looking at people who are have done their student teaching at one of 6 teacher training institutions in Washington State, and we're going to be looking to see what is the probability that they get a job, how long does it take them, what is the relationship between the kind of environment where they do their student teaching and the kind kind of environment where they end up, and kind of speculating a little bit about whether there's any connections to teacher effectiveness as measured by value added. Yeah, I forgot to say what are my ground rules, and my ground rules are that I would love to have interaction. So absolutely let me know if things aren't clear, but beyond that, I just think that these things go a lot more interesting if people comment and say, hey, I think the following about what you've just shown me. So I absolutely welcome questions. So ultimately, we are trying to figure out something about what makes for effective teaching. And I'm going to, I guess I should start with some definitions. I'm going to use the term student teaching and sort of internship interchangeably. I'm going to use the term cooperating teacher and mentor teacher and supervisor probably interchangeably. But the ultimate project is to try and connect student teaching experiences to teacher effectiveness and kind of what kind of career path do we see people follow. This work comes out of research that basically just tried to draw inferences about where did you get your credential, where did you graduate from, and how much of your effectiveness can be attributed to where did you get your credential. And that, of course, is going to combine both who did the institutions bring in, so what is the selection, and whatever kind of training they are getting. And I think it's very hard to tease those things apart, at least with the kind of data sets that we have access to. We are looking at all of the interns from these 6 institutions who actually have gotten a credential to teach in Washington State, so they have passed the required licensure test and done the paperwork. So it looks like these are people who very much have an intention of going into the labor force, and we observe all of these interns from, again, these 6 institutions. There are 20 in Washington over a variety of years, and we're able to link both the places where they did their student teaching, and in some cases the people who they did their student teaching with, the cooperating teacher, to the administrative databases that we've got going in Washington State.
Ben, are you able, post the internship, post the student teaching, are you able to observe anything about the interns who don't post the teaching? Do you have UI records or anything?
We do not currently have that matched up, and we would only have it for the very recent cohorts. But yes, we should be able to do that. And the other thing that we have is that I'm going to talk mainly about whether what happens when they go into do or don't go into public schools. But we've recently added in teachers who are in private schools. That data is a mess. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about, we've estimated the same models for the private schools and putting the private and public schools together. Just by way of a little background, I think that teacher training programs are under a fair amount of scrutiny. And it used to be that people who did value added were kind of the boogeymen, and then NCTQ came along, and so now it's kind of ironic because I hear the criticism about what do people know about NCTQ? Okay, the criticism of what NCTQ is doing is that, hey, well, you should be looking at outcomes. so the value added people don't look quite so bad now, which is kind of nice. There's been some research on the connection between pre-service experiences and teacher effectiveness by Boyd et al. And of course, Jim Wyckoff is whenever you see the Boyd et al., his name is all X. But he's been doing a lot of this kind of work too. And what's interesting, I think, about this work, which I hopefully adds to the body of what we know, is that there's a really sizable segment of people who get trained to be teachers who don't end up ultimately in the teaching workforce. Nationally, it looks like it's about, we have great data, but I think it's about twice as many people get prepared to teach as there are actually slots. In Washington State, it looks like about 35% of those who get trained are not actually hired in the state of Washington. Yes?
What's the labor market like for teachers in Washington? Is it a competitive labor market?
Well, let me put that question on hold just because I'm going to put up a map of Washington, and it would be kind of, I can talk about it a little bit better, the map thing. So I think there's kind of potentially two consequences of looking only at those people who are only in the workforce as opposed to the potential people who might be in the workforce. One, you kind of don't get the sense from an individual's perspective of how your training experiences might affect the probability or timing of hire. So as far, I have never seen it maybe out there, but I haven't seen research that quantifies what is probably the expected labor market relationships that we see, showing that if you get endorsed in a STEM or special education, that your probability of getting hired is significantly higher. You get hired more quickly. And then the other thing that I think is important is that when we start thinking about teacher effectiveness, that you could, because you're looking at a very select sample, you could make some incorrect conclusions, you could draw incorrect conclusions about the connection between pre-service experiences and student achievement if there really is systematic relationships between those pre-service experiences who ends up with market. So down the line, that's going to be the focus of some of this work. All right, this is in case this is I talk too slowly, don't get through it kind of slide. So here's sort of the big picture of what we ask and what we find. So when we look at the probability of workforce entry, and I should say, we can't tell how much of what we see is driven by teacher preferences or employer preferences. So that's a big caveat, and why I'm going to try to be very careful about saying anything with any kind of strong causal link. I'll speculate a lot, and I think that a lot of the findings will seem pretty consistent with what we might expect. So, I already said this, that I should not be moving. So you want me to stay right there? I can move a little bit. Right. You hear that it is a lot harder for school systems to recruit and retain teachers in certain grades and subjects, and that is certainly reflected on the front end of the teacher pipeline when we look at the probability of getting a job within a certain amount of time and how much time it takes to get a job. So I'll show you in terms of magnitude what we find, but very clearly, if you want to get a job and you want to get a job quickly, then you ought to get endorsed in STEM or special education. The other thing that I think is interesting is what we don't find to be statistically significant, which is anything about sort of the academic proficiency of the interns, GPA, licensure test scores, and there's a little bit of relationship in terms of the institutional selectivity, even though we're looking at these 6 institutions. So we're not looking at big sample size, but it looks like some institutions people all get hired, some they don't. And importantly, we don't find any relationship between the measure of effectiveness, the value-added measure of effectiveness of the cooperating teacher and the likelihood that an intern gets hired. And I think I would have expected that the kind of recommendations, word of mouth, et cetera, cooperating teachers, that matters. And to the degree that people have different reputations based on their ability to, their effectiveness, that you might take some cooperating teachers more seriously than others. So I kind of expected maybe we would see a relationship without them.
Dan?
Yes?
Do you have any information about how long cooperating teachers have been in that role?
That is a great question. I'm going to, yes. And that's one of our sort of next steps. So I'll just say quickly right now that 2 of the things that we're doing as next steps are looking to see if the experience of cooperating teachers as cooperating teachers, as opposed to their experience, which we have done. We've looked at that, matters. And secondly, whether there may be some schools where they sort of specialize in training interns, and so maybe there are school level effects too. We'll see if that makes a difference.
Dan?
Yeah.
So the teachers that you're talking about are coming out of undergraduate degree and going into teaching, or are they doing masters?
It's a mix, and so in some models we control for the kind of program that they come from. The data is a little bit messy, so I don't think we get it right all the time. It seems like it should be simple to analyze that question, but what we got in a lot of cases, actually in almost probably 5 of the 6 cases, we got PDF, we got paper that said over the last 10 years, 5 years, whatever they had available, these are the places where people did their student teaching, and these were the cooperating teachers. And sometimes there was information about their degree, sometimes there wasn't, and we did our best from the state database to infer what the degree was that they received, but I think it's imperfect. Other questions about that sort of big overarching first finding? Okay, the second thing we're looking at is, does the kind of school where you do your student teaching seem to be predictive of anything about where you get your first job? So if you teach in a higher poverty setting, are you more likely to get a first job in a higher poverty school? And very good, I just pull them all up. And the answer is yes, that there is a relationship, even though interns typically do get their student teaching experiences in much more advantaged schools than the kind of schools that they're going to end up with in their first job, that you do see that there's a relationship between the characteristics of the students and of intern school and first job school. And then the other thing that we're looking at is whether or not, what is sort of the geography of the job. And what was kind of striking to us is that a pretty high percentage of student teachers end up employed in the school in which they did their student teaching. And I think these kind of labor market dynamics are really interesting when you start to think about the degree that teachers are distributed equitably or inequitably across schools. So I had never really thought much about the role that student teaching may play in creating those distributions. I think the very preliminary evidence that I'll get into suggests that it does play some kind of role, and that may be really important in thinking about equity issues, thinking about fit issues. Okay, I'm going to just very quickly talk about that. There's sort of this small literature, you've got the sites out there that connect. Where did you get your credential to teacher effectiveness? I would say there's some disagreement in the literature about whether the credential granting institution explains a meaningful amount of the variation that we see in teacher effectiveness. My take is that it does. The differences that we see between schools that are graduating effective teachers and ineffective teachers, at least at the extremes of the distribution, that those differences are large enough to be educationally meaningful. And just as a bit of editorializing connected to this issue of teacher training institutions being under scrutiny, I'm glad that there's scrutiny, because I think that there's a lot to be learned about what people are doing when they're getting trained. And I'm glad that we've kind of moved in this country, I would say, beyond debates that are, alternative certification versus not, into what can we learn about the experiences that people are getting at different training institutions. So I think that is for the good, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that, downstream, my guess is that the majority of teachers will continue to be trained at kind of traditional teacher training institutions, and that the way that we will learn about what makes for effective teacher training is by getting data out of those institutions about the experiences that students are having. There's a kind of emerging literature that focuses on student teaching experiences, and again, Mr. Et or Mr. All is and some of this literature suggests that your student teaching experiences are potentially very, very important. One of the, I'm going to use this terminology, so it's an opportunity for me to introduce it here, is Matt Bothell has identified the stay ratio as an important predictor of teacher effectiveness. And so I'll tell you what the stay ratio is. Let me just begin by what my hypothesis would have been about teacher effectiveness. I would have thought that if you did your student teaching in an environment that looked more like the environment that you were likely to go into, that you would be a more effective teacher. And that's not what Matt finds. So sort of what I can characterize as the match between the student teaching experience and the first job experience, that doesn't seem to be so important. What seemed to be more important is kind of how coherent is the school in which you do your student teaching, and maybe it's about the learning environment. And the way that he measures this is with what he calls the stay ratio, and it's basically the percentage of teachers who choose in his work in New York City, in their work in New York City, actually, I don't know if you were on this paper, but anyway, the work in New York City, the percentage of teachers who choose to stay in the school out of those teachers who stay in the district, right? So he kind of pulls out retirements because he says, you don't want to penalize a school for having a lower stay ratio because a higher turnover because there are a lot of teachers who are retiring. So in this work, we're going to do something similar, except that our stay ratio is not going to be a district stay ratio; it's going to be a state stay ratio. So we actually estimated a couple of different ways. It doesn't make any difference, but I think what I'm going to show you is the state stay ratio. Just a little bit more background. Very clear that teachers end up teaching close to where they grew up or where they do their training, often called the call home. There's kind of mixed evidence about the who's being drawn into teaching. Historically, it looked like back in the 60s, when there was a lot of labor market discrimination, teaching was likely to get sort of the upper end of the academic proficiency distribution. It's obviously a female-dominated occupation, so it's not surprising that when there were more opportunities opened up, that was not going to stay the same, as the research suggests. There's some disagreement about whether or not districts prefer to hire people with strong academic credentials. So there's more Boyd et al. Work on this. And I think the conclusion is that they tend to hire people with stronger academic capabilities. There's also work by Dale Ballou, which is now older work, but Dale looks at teachers versus lawyers and a couple other occupations, and concludes that the probability of getting hired is higher in other occupations if you have stronger academic credentials than it is in teaching, and that the financial rewards are stronger. And then there's just a lot of research, both based on applications to schools and just more broadly when you look at teacher mobility, that suggests that teachers prefer to be in schools with fewer disadvantaged students. And I should say there that is how you characterize disadvantage. It's often characterized as by free reduced lunch, because I think that that's kind of a PC thing. But my read on the literature is that teachers care about the racial ethnic distribution in schools. And so they may care about the poverty level, but there's also, to some degree, sort of just keying off of what you see visually about the students that may not be associated with it. Okay, so getting to the details of what we actually did. So we're using, and before I forget, there was a question about the labor market, so don't let me forget to come back to that. So we're looking at 6 teacher training institutions in Washington. Here are the 20, the geographic distribution of the 20 that exist in Washington. And just by way of context, Washington is a state that has had historically very few alternative paths of entry into the labor market. It's only in the last couple of years that Teach America has sort of been led into the state. Those have been sort of pitched battles that have gone on. We're looking at these 6 institutions. They are the 3 University of Washington institutions, Tacoma, Bothell, and Seattle. Western Washington University, Central, and Kiel. And if we look at the school districts across the state, the darker shades are the percentage of those school districts' teachers supplied by the institutions in our sample, and lighter shades are districts that are supplying, are districts that are less served by these 6 institutions, right? So you can see, I just want to make really clear, this is a convenient sample. These were the institutions where we could get the data. And so we miss a lot of Eastern Washington, right? They are served by different institutions. Overall, we have about a third of the new teachers that come into the state come in through one of the 6 institutions, but we're clearly missing a lot in Eastern Washington. So let me talk a little bit about the labor market just for a second. So, and this is just my take on the labor market. Washington is split by the Cascade Mountains, and voting patterns on either side of the Cascades are radically different. So Eastern Washington is much more, this is sort of my spiel on Washington, I guess, is much more conservative than Western Washington. The districts on the eastern side of the state tend to be much bigger geographically, much more rural. And so I think that there are many fewer labor market opportunities there are fewer opportunities to switch from district to district. That is harder to do than, say, if you are employed in the Puget Sound and there are a great number of districts within 50 miles of the Puget Sound. So other questions about the labor market is we're on a state salary schedule. So there's a little bit of variation within the state in terms of the salaries, but the variation all stems from the redesign of the state finance formula, which happened in 1977. And actually, there's 2 sources of variations. One is some districts in 1977 were exempted from being on the state schedule. They could have a multiple of the state schedule. And then the other thing is that teachers make money from coaching and all kinds of other supplements. And so that's one of the ways that you see districts that perhaps have a harder time getting people to come to their district. They're clearly changing salaries to reflect that.
So in Washington, is it competitive to get a job? There are some states, right, where getting a teacher job is really difficult because they're highly desirable areas. Lots of teachers want to be there. There's some parts of the country where the market for teachers is really expanding, so they're hiring.
So I would not, I think I can't characterize the state as a whole. What I'll show you is that, or I won't really show it to you, I'll show it to you from the teacher's perspective. It really depends on your endorsement area. So there's the excess supply, which I kind of hate that term as an economist, but I'll use it anyway. The excess supply, where there are actually more people produced for a particular position than there are slots, is in elementary education. And there are some school districts where they have, hundreds and hundreds of applicants per available slot. And there are some school districts where they really struggle to fill their slots. And it's kind of what you'd expect. The rural school districts have a harder time getting, a physics teacher. Okay, convenience sample. And I just want to give you a sense of the student characteristics for your first job schools for the participating institutions, which is this column, the non-participating institutions and the out-of-state institutions. And the things that I would point out is that the pass rates are a little bit higher. This is the kind of audience where I'm going to get all these things have been standardized. So many questions like, why doesn't this total down to 0? And this is because we did all the normalization for sort of the school level measures at the school level, but then these are the teacher needs. So it's about the number of teachers in big schools. So the pass rates are a little bit higher in math and reading. For participating institutions, the students look like they are by at least some at a little bit less disadvantaged than the institutions that don't participate. So they're a little bit different, but then all 20, but I'm not struck by them being radically different. Let's see. Again, I said 6 institutions out of 20. You can see the number of teachers that they train per year. They tend to be some of the bigger institutions. Western Washington is one of the state's big teachers, suppliers of teachers. And the other thing that kind of jumped out at me is that there are some interesting differences in the kind of teachers that are trained. So these institutions tend to, for instance, to train more of the state special education teachers and a little bit more of the math teachers. Issue here. Okay. All right. Okay, so we have about 8,000 interns over a large number of years. Some of them, not at all of the schools, but at least some of the schools we had information about internships that went back all the way to the late 90s. But you can see that for the majority of the sample, we're talking about 2005 and beyond. But there's about a total of just over 8,000 interns in our sample. About 2,600 of these, 8,000, they never show up as being hired. So aside, maybe they eventually get hired, but there is a distribution. There are people from the early cohorts that we see are not hired over a decade or more. Okay, so who's hired and not hired? So this table of means is going to preview the more sophisticated regression results. What do we see? Well, one of the things that we see that's interesting, and this shows up in the regression, is that people who are hired tend to be younger, and that shows up as significant in the regression. We also see that you are much more likely to be hired if you get endorsed in science, math, and special education. Right? Big differences. And again, not a real aha. I think that's what you would expect given the label. Yeah.
Can you clarify the definition of not hired? Is it people who are moving out of the state and you're not seeing them?
I don't know. They're not hired into the Washington public schools. So again, I think down the line we'll be able to say, are you employed outside of education in Washington? But we're going to have a hard time getting a handle of people moving out of state.
I have a quick question. So your average age over here is 27.95, and in the earlier slide you had shown the average is now 30 years. So why how did the age so dramatically go down?
I need to go back to the early slide. So this is about so the average for this. So this is the higher and not higher. So the average for the sample is probably around just over 28.
Yeah.
All right. And the earlier slides, which we can go back to, I think were more about teachers in general from all institutions of the state. Maybe what the column that you were looking at, not just the 6. So I don't know what the hired and not hired looks like for the other institutions. Yeah.
What other endorsement areas are there, or are these all?
No, these are just select. There's lots of endorsement areas. You know, when you start getting into this endorsement data, you realize that there's just a tremendous number of endorsement areas. So the endorsement areas tend to be broken out by elementary, middle, and high school, reading specialist, elementary education. So these are some of the bigger ones that I called out. Yeah.
I am from Texas, so I know bilingual education and English or ESL education is a really big deal. Do you see that at all in Washington?
Yeah.
I just when you talk about the ones that are hired, it's usually like STEM, special ed, and bilingual.
Yeah, and there are those were not the only ones that were significant. I kind of think that the ELL was a relatively small category, so we tried to lump them together ultimately into sort of sensible, broader categories. But my guess would be just from anecdotally that it's easier to get hired if you have that kind of specialization. Jim, you have your hand up?
Well, I'm sort of interested in this notion that you produce twice as many people who ultimately get jobs in the state of Washington, and the notion that there is potentially this reserve pool of people who would go into teaching. And so I'm wondering how you might be able to get at that. And one way might be you can probably show the distribution of when people become certified to teach and when they get hired, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine that's got a pretty big right tail on it. But I'm sort of interested to try to get more information about are these people who, basically went into education and just decided, this isn't what I want to do. They're working, and so it gets back to the question of Ben asked, I think about are you doing something else? Did they leave the state? I'm just trying to figure out this issue because there's a lot of complaints, right, that teacher ed programs are overproducing.
Yeah.
And trying to get a better sense of whether that's actually the case or not.
Yeah. So I think I don't have a good handle on that. I think we can get a better sense. But one of the arguments for looking at the teachers who are actually credentialed is they've taken those couple of steps to look like they've taken the time to take the licensure test. And so is that a hurdle? It's probably not a huge hurdle, but they look like they at least want that teaching as an option. Yeah.
So when that age there is the age at kind of higher or just kind of over, and I'm just trying to think about what the age point is for those two groups. And then second, thinking that 28 is kind of high.
I think it's high too. Yep. And part of it is that there are a number of graduate programs in the state. There's one other thing I wanted to say about this issue of endorsements, which is that lots of teachers have multiple endorsements. So the other way we can kind of get at this perhaps is to look at people who are employed and then go back and get a second endorsement. Maybe or not employed, but get a second endorsement.
I can't remember from the prior side. Do you know anything about their prior labor market experience?
No.
Are they not sending in, so when they're applying to these programs, are they not sending in, Allison's question about the age, which, kind of, the mean, you take the average student, they're kind of 6 years out of college, give or take. Are they not sending in resumes? I mean, could you leave aside the problem of getting the resumes and inputting them, but let's say those were solvable problems. Do you think you could get at it? Do the programs have that information?
The programs, I don't know whether they obtain them, but they clearly they have them when they're thinking about who to admit. And the other thing is in Washington, as everywhere, there's a lot of heterogeneity in what these programs look like. So some of them are very selective programs, and it's hard to get into the teacher training program at UW Seattle. That's not the case at some of the programs in Washington. They look a lot closer than they should. So this is some summary statistics for the internship school. All right. So again, state average for those that are hired and those who are not hired. And here is what I was suggesting about the stay ratio. That again, standardized at school level. That the hired interns tend to come from schools with lower stay ratio. So when I first looked at this, I thought, oh, God, this is the opposite of what Matt had found. But then you think about it, and you realize that if you're doing your internship at a school with a very high stay ratio, the probability is that you're not going to find a slot at that school. And so if you begin to think about the student teaching experience not just as a training experience, but kind of a screening process that schools may use, this finding makes perfect sense.
So, Dan, as a teacher educator, I would also want you to look at that training experience, because we know it takes a number of years for young teachers to be comfortable. They'll probably be comfortable in a school where there are less poor or disadvantaged students, because there's probably less chaos, more opportunity for mentoring. And so I think there's any number of reasons why students choose to be where they are and choose to apply for a job in different places. Is there any way you can get access to where they apply to? What districts they apply to?
Not from the state data, but I'm working with Spokane on a project looking at applicants.
Right, just to see, not even just to see what areas they...
Yep. So as part of that project, we'll be able to look at that. Okay, so this just gets into the modeling. When we start to think about econometrically what we're going to do, well, you can estimate logit models that say you're hired or you're not hired. The logit models, you've got to make a decision of hired by, and the assumption of the model is that if you're not hired, you're never going to be hired, which is clearly not the right assumption. And then the other option is, there may be many more options, but the other option that jumped to my mind was, doing a survival model. And then the survival models also have problems because the survival models assume that if we don't see you employed yet, you're someday going to be employed. So what we opted to do was use a split population model approach, and the split population model, as I understand it, should sort of simultaneously estimates the probability of being hired and the length of time, and doesn't make the same sort of extreme assumptions that a logit or survival model make. It does make some assumptions that probably are not quite right, but it seems like the kind of the right econometric fit. But I would absolutely welcome any comments, but we'd love to hear someone say, no, that just doesn't seem right to me at all. Hearing no, that doesn't seem right to me at all, I will go on. Okay, so what? And actually, you know what I could use? I could use somebody. Alice, I'm going to look at you. I could use somebody to sort of warn me about how much time. Like, when do you want to warn? I want a warning. I want to leave time for just sort of general discussion. So let's say I leave time 15 minutes for general discussion, and I need a warning that is 10 minutes before that 15 minutes. All right. So I want to add. It's 10:15 to me. So it's what? 1:15 here. And we ended at 2. Okay, I'm oriented now. All right. Yes.
I knew that slides ago, but if someone becomes a substitute teacher, which category do they belong to?
So we only counted people who moved into a regular teaching position That's a great question. That's one of the other things that we're going to do is look at other kinds of employment in the district. Yeah, I think that's the right question, because it seems to me that one of the ways into the district, especially if you really want to be in a particular place, is to get into the substitute pool. Yeah. Okay, so I've ad nauseum said that endorsement area matters. So let me just show you just what the magnitudes look like. So STEM, special ed, we see that 80+% of those people with those endorsements get hired, whereas it's about 65% if you get an elementary ed endorsement. And again, maybe some of this is sort of teacher preferences, but my take is that this is a reflection of the teacher labor market. And it's kind of crazy that the labor market doesn't respond to these issues. Yes?
So the STEM fields, the reason that your probability is that high is because people who are in the STEM fields are leaving, and so there are more positions open. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's I think the small part of the problem. So part of it is that and actually I don't know if this is true in Washington State. There's some evidence that if you're in the STEM area that attrition is higher. I think kind of marginally higher. The big issue is that there are many fewer people that go into STEM. So it's more on the front end side.
It's a supply problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you going to talk a little more about how these interns get into the certain type of schools? Because it would seem to me like if it's kind of a competitive within an institution, then the best students that go to the best schools, and the best students might be the STEM students.
I'm going to talk about it largely out of ignorance, just a little bit of sort of having talked to the people who coordinate that from the university, and I think that it happens in very different ways, so from institution to institution. In fact, NCTQ, one of their they rate schools on a number of standards, and one of the standards that they're rated schools on is the way that the mentorship is done. So does it look like there's anything documented that's purposeful in terms of who a mentor teacher, that cooperative teacher is? And it looks like in some places it is, or in some places it isn't, and it's documented. Maybe it's careful everywhere. But from just talking to people, sometimes it's really centralized, and the university has a written contract with the school district and the school, and it's very well thought out. And other places, it feels like that decision is much more left up to the individual prospective teacher to find a place. And so I don't know how to characterize that for everyone. And I would love to have more information about sort of the process that's going on. So if we can get some funding to do this, we will go and try to collect some original information like that.
And the other thing to keep in mind in that process is that teaching is very contextual and personality-based. So on what they are basing one teacher to one student matchups may be very different than looking at how the teacher training program matches with school districts. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be fairly nuanced.
Yeah.
For individuals.
Yeah, I think that's probably. So I believe those kinds of things matter. I think that those kinds of things are often very difficult to capture in the kind of data that we're using here. But if you can, that's great. Okay, and when we look at the probability of being hired within a certain number of years, again, it's what you'd expect, that STEM and special ed, you're quote, more likely to be hired within a year, and sort of out of time, you're more likely to be hired. They all kind of level off after a couple of years. And these were estimated to allow the curves to be different over time. Okay, so a couple other things. I mentioned that age seems to matter, and this is where I'm going to do a little bit of speculating. But just as an example of the magnitude. It's about, if you're 32 years old, you're about 5% less likely to be hired than if you're 25. And, I guess I found that to be kind of a surprising finding. I think that there's perhaps a view that teachers ought to be teachers for their career. And so maybe there's some suspicion of people who are, changing careers midway that's sort of not the model of teaching. But I don't know. I don't know what to make of the age.
Is it possible that maybe a 32-year-old has other things that are happening in their life that might take, and it's not just about applying,
Sure.
not getting your job, you also fail to apply or choose.
Yeah. Right. I mean, you're more maybe perhaps more likely to have a joint labor market problem. There are a lot of so it's. I want to make clear, I am speculating. What's driving that result?
Maybe the 32-year-olds are going to work at Gates Foundation.
It could be. Yeah.
A question about the hiring process from a principal's perspective. I know some places, wealthier districts, I've seen some in Ohio where they have almost an HR company come in and you submit things online. Is the screening process, is it like that or is it more traditional?
Totally varies across the school districts in Washington. So in a district like Seattle, Spokane, I don't know Tacoma, but Seattle and Spokane, there's a centralized computer-based process where all the materials get submitted electronically. There's some central screening, and then it goes out to the schools. In a lot of the rural districts, that is not the way it works. It's much more person to person, and I would guess that the hiring is based more on connections. The race results are surprising and controversial. So it's white interns are 8% more likely than non-white interns to be hired. Most of the non-white interns are African American, even though the majority of them. So that seems to me pretty inconsistent with the notion that school systems are trying to diversify their workforces. Now, maybe it has nothing to do with the preferences of the districts, right? So that's one interpretation, is that maybe there's some discrimination in hiring, or they see this as a fit issue with the kind of students that they have. I don't know, but it's also entirely possible that some of the minority interns have better labor market opportunities outside of teaching or outside of the state. So we'll try and get at least some of those issues, but it was a surprising finding to me.
And does it change at all as the all else changes, right? Because you have limited data for your whole sample, limited covariates for your whole sample, and more covariates for subsets of the sample?
We have most of the covariates for the most of the sample. Where the sample starts to change is when we start to talk about the value-added stuff.
But this is pretty stable across what you include. This different.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember from, maybe, I can't remember if I put it in the table of means, but it's pretty stable. Yeah.
Are these results controlled for the training institution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for, so we had training institution fixed effects. And the 6 institutions are jointly significant, so it does matter where you get trained.
But these things don't vary across institutions. These result ratings.
These are within institution findings. Yeah.
So the covariates are based on the intern and not based on the school that they're going to provide. So you would have a predominantly white school which is having predominantly white teachers, or you have a white principal who's hiring all white teachers. It has nothing to do with the school. It has to do.
It's all about the characteristics of the intern and the school in which the internship happened. Because, of course, when we're looking at hiring, we would only have the characteristics of the schools for those who are hired.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm going to talk in a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about some other results that do sort of
It's a matching thing, right? The hiring
Yeah.
process is a math process, so it has to work both ways.
Yeah. Okay, and I mentioned this issue of the stay ratio, and so, it does raise the possibility that the results about stay ratio and teacher effectiveness could be biased by the selection issue. So we're trying hard to think about, well, if we were going to try and do some sample selection corrected model, what would be the instrument that we would use that would determine, whether or not you ended up in the labor force, but was not related to your teaching effectiveness. And I'm racking my brain a little bit, and I couldn't come up with something, but Alice is going to tell me right now.
What is the thing that the stay ratio is trying to get at?
So I think it's trying to get at the coherence and culture of the school in which you do your student teaching.
I wonder if you do it because that could have something to do with coherence as well.
Yeah, but it's also going to be related to something with churning.
With the school, so it's like.
But it's going to be related to both the probability that
you can control.
so yeah, actually that's a good idea. So there's no slots, right? There's no slots. It's just that there's a lot of movement within the school, which maybe is good, maybe is bad.
Yeah, and it's hard to say for sure that gets out of the underlying thing, but.
Oh, I like that, Alice. You did. Yeah, thank you.
I wonder where I came up with that.
I don't know, but it's a darn good idea. Okay. What doesn't matter? I mentioned this. Academic proficiency doesn't matter, and nothing about the cooperating teacher seems to matter. Nothing that we know, which is their experience, their value added for a subsample of the teachers.
So Dan, you said that when you were giving your definitions earlier, that cooperating teacher and supervising teacher were sort of the same thing, but aren't there faculty at the preparation institutions that are sort of supervising the faculty? And I'm wondering whether, their experience, their connections in the labor market have some, in the same way that faculty might have some influence on graduate students.
I don't have data on them, but so I knew I was going to say probably supervisor when I meant cooperating teacher because I don't have the right lingo down, but you're right, supervisor tends to be from the university side. And yeah, I just don't have anything about that.
For all these characteristics that don't seem to be related to the probability of being hired, is the variation across the sample? You're using the variation within programs. So I could see programs having preferences for placing their interns with particular types of cooperating teachers.
Can I stop you for just a second?
Yeah.
So there is this that this includes year program effects. So you think that might, to the degree that there's only a person, which is the institution's not familiar with, there's a person who's supervising. Those year program effects should be capturing something about the person. But sorry to interrupt you.
Well, so I'm just wondering, so is there sufficient within program within year variation in these characteristics of cooperating teachers?
To detect something?
Yeah, are you restricting yourself so that that's the reason why these aren't popping up, right?
Yeah, that's I can't answer that. That's something we gotta look at. I think that there is. My recollection is I think I actually do have an ugly picture of all the coefficient estimates somewhere in my backup slides, which maybe we'll get to. But I don't think it was an issue of imprecision. Okay, so I'm going to quickly. You're going to warn me, right, Allison? Okay. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to look at is, and there is nothing written about these results. So what I've just described to you is in this semi-coherent paper. This is more kind of hot off the presses. Do we see a relationship between the kind of place that you are doing your student teaching and the kind of place you end up employing? So first off, the call of home kind of finds. Do we see that in Washington? And the answer is yes. 8% of teachers who are employed in the same district. 35% are within 25 miles. 50%, about 50% are within 50 miles. These don't look out of line with, Michelle. Is that him? Okay. Still flexing. Yeah. Michelle. Right? Is it right in here? Yeah. Or the other papers that the Boyd et al. Team have done. Okay, but we can look both at the institution and we can look at where you actually did your student teaching. And when we do that, this is what the results look like. So it looks to me like the call at home is about where did you do your student teaching. Right? Because it's a much higher proportion get hired around student teaching. The other thing that I think is kind of shocking is look at the magnitude of these differences, right? So that suggests that there are a number of places where the school that you do your student teaching is far from the training institution. And that's what the data say. We haven't dug into it yet, but that just looks kind of weird to me.
So it's possible that the students actually, for example, here we have a choice of distant placements, that the students are asking to be placed in some of these distant placements. So that might be a question you pursue.
So can you figure out actually where home is?
No.
That would be my hypothesis. They're returning back to the schools in the neighborhood from which they went to school.
Yeah. I think the answer is we can't figure out where home is, but there's a pit somewhere in the state where all of the data reside. The data out of the pit, and you have to make a case for getting it out of the pit. I don't think that element resides there, but I would go back and check.
So maybe you can just find out what high school from which they apply to the training institution.
Yeah.
For the student teaching, that 15%, how many of those schools are low-performing schools that hire the student teachers? Or how many?
I can't tell you. I can tell you, I just can't tell you off the top of my head. We've looked at that.
Did it seem like a substantial amount?
Yeah, I just don't. I don't remember. I know that I should know because we ran some regressions where we looked at the probability that you would be hired into the school in which you did your student teaching, conditional on your student teaching school having at least one opening. So I know we looked at that. But I just don't remember what the disadvantage looked like. Yeah.
I think Jim's question is really important, right? Because in the sense that if people are just selecting to student teach near where they grew up or near where they have family, then this is in some ways not really all that interesting.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if it turns out it's not so close to home and that it just what matters is you student teach in the community for a year and you get to know where the grocery stores are and the places on the weekends and everything, and that familiarity leads you to want to stay in that area, that has clear policy implications, right? Because then you could incentivize people to go to, you could work with however people get placed in student teaching to kind of capitalize on this, but that only is relevant if people aren't making active.
Well, I think it's not interesting if it's the case that they're going back to home because the institution does have some say. I mean, they have to sort of prove this, right? So I don't know whether they should say you can't go student teach near your home, right? I don't know what the policy would be, but I do think that there is some policy control regardless of the reason that you end up at a particular school. But I agree with you that it looks like there's more policy if it's not about people just going back to where they grew up.
Are any of the teaching programs distance learning, or are they all classroom based?
They're all so all of them have some courses that could be. I don't know. All of the universities have some distance courses. I don't know if the distance courses are part of the being in the teaching program. They're not like USC's all online certification program. But that will certainly help explain what was going on. Okay. Okay, so what does it look like? What does your student teaching experience look like as compared to your first job? So, first thing, I think the thing that's kind of most striking is that internship schools are substantially more advantaged, at least in terms of poverty, than the state as a whole for your first job school. And that's true across a couple of different dimensions. You know, if you look at percent free reduced lunch, if you look at the passing rates on the state assessment. Go ahead.
So to me, those means don't look that
They don't look that
important.
different.
I mean, they're actually statistically different. But it would be interesting to see the distributions to the droves of means. So are you really seeing much higher concentrations of, people with 70% free reduced price lunch in one of those groups and not the other? Because that, in some sense, becomes an educational issue, right?
Yeah. I'm going to write on the paper that was left here. Is that? Yeah, I'm up to like 4 things in my head that I need to remember. I'm just worried that now I'm to the point where I'm not going to remember. Yep, I agree, Jim. Okay, so when we regress the characteristics of the first job, the students at your first job school against the characteristics of your internship school, what we find is this line. So there's a strong positive correlation, and of course this gap again is that your first job school is likely much more disadvantaged than your internship school. But we also see that there's some kind of interesting differences that are associated with where you did your internship and the specialization of the training. So, and I think again, to me, this makes sense in terms of the labor market, that if you get endorsed in STEM or special ed, your first job school is a less disadvantaged school. That's true if you taught in a suburban school, and if you were hired into the same school which you do student teaching. Again, labor market, and I don't know what they'll all of this is sort of suggested. We haven't really dug into these data a whole lot. The other thing that we found was, I said this, that if you get hired into your internship school, and we look at your value added down the line, the people who get hired into their internship school have higher value added, modestly higher, but it is statistically significant.
It's not exactly your first school.
Yeah, in my recollection, it's not the difference between, first and second. It's not a full year's worth of experience, but it's half a year's worth of experience. So these are all very kind of suggestive findings. If you were to say, does this support, the argument that school districts really care about the academic proficiency of the people they're hiring? The evidence is no, but we really can't tell whether it's the preferences of the hiring officials or the prospective teachers. This issue of drop home, we've got these very interesting findings that it's about where did you do your student teaching, but maybe they are just going home. right? But I guess the point is that A, we should find that out. And then secondly, if it turns out that it's not just about going home, then we ought to be focused on where did you do your student teaching as opposed to what was your institution, especially as we go forward and we're likely to see a lot more of the kind of online, the online education, so that the institution, geographic location of the institutions will be less important. And then the kind of not but sensible findings with regards to the labor market, that there really look like big differences in the probability of time and higher if you get a credential that is in high demand. Okay, last slide, I think. Where are we going? We're going to try and explore a little bit more about whether the student teaching, the degree to which it can be viewed as a screening process. And I already talked about the value-added stuff. We're going to be looking more at hiring in private schools, and if we get our hands on it, a sufficient sample of hiring outside of private schools. We have added in private schools and private school teachers into these models, and the results don't change when we look at them together. When they do a dummy for private school, we haven't looked separately at the private schools. Actually, that's not true. We have looked separately at the private schools because that's how we got the special education money. And then we're going to be looking more at the cooperating teacher effects. This was the question. Yeah, this is the question about are there some people who just are more effective cooperating teachers? So we're going to try and detail, which sounds easy to do, but it is messy. We're going to try and figure out who's been a cooperating teacher over time to see if the experience you have as a cooperating teacher matters, and if there are certain schools that look like they really are training schools for student teachers. So that's it, and I'm happy to just have a discussion.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of the questions that come up, like there's some potential to go back and forbid that you go and get someone to say that, or I wonder if it might be faster and easier to do the survey. Do you have any potential for that?
It's all about resources and how we choose to spend the money. So yes, what we've been trying to do is convince the training institutions that we're working with that they want this done.
Right, so it's like they can do more about it.
And actually some, Western Washington, they do a survey of their trainees and ask them about lots of things. So we're beginning to dig into the Western Washington data, and fortunately Western Washington is one of the big suppliers. So our thought is to start to analyze their survey, which some of the questions are not similar to the survey that you guys did, and try and get a sense of what looks like it's important, so that when we hopefully develop a survey, we can take it, a good survey that we take to all the institutions. Ideally, not just the 6, but all the institutions in the state.
So I don't know that much about teacher training here, but can you just describe more about what the process is for how teachers get matched to their student teaching placements? Is it primarily driven by the training institutions or by the students, or is there, how does that process?
So I'm sure that there are many people in this room who probably answer this better than me. But I'm going to say, I'll say 1 minute on it. There's heterogeneity across the different institutions. So not all institutions do the same thing. I believe that all institutions have some kind of agreement with the school district, because there has to be someone on the district side that sort of signs off. I don't know that they all have to have a formal signed agreement with schools. And it looks like some are very purposeful about where they send their trainees, and some of them are not, and leave it to some extent up to the trainee. And so the trainee says, I'd like to do it here. And people then say, okay, and they sort of sign off at that point. So, but that's my
I
take.
agree with what you said, but here we don't know the students choose.
But some institutions
Some do because there's a number, I mean, it's a time-consuming, difficult process, and you do what you, and because learning to teach is so contextual, that we do want the student to be on board with the environment in which they're being trained. So we do, there are lots of ways to work around that need, and some institutions have large numbers of students, and if the student can demand on the field placement office, then they allow the students to use it.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you could take advantage of that variation between them, because, in areas where schools are really telling the students where to go, you might have different advice.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that, the sample size right now doesn't, actually, it's problematic in Washington because there are 20 institutions.
Yeah.
But, right now I'm dealing with 6.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that it's important. I'm not sure what we would do. I'm not sure that we'd be able to find much sophistication.
So you can observe where the internships for each program are placed.
Right.
Is this sort of a random, because some of those places were very far from home, right? And you could well imagine that is a recurring pattern in some preparation programs, but not others. Those others that are purposeful, like Susan was saying, will tend to place people in the same schools year after year.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Jim. And also, you might, when you do your survey, you might want to survey the field placement coordinator in each of your schools, and maybe the cooperating teachers that the schools use, or the district person who signed the memorandum of understanding.
Yeah, I think those are great suggestions.
They're almost like lab series associated with something program.
Right.
So it's like a whole school is responsible with.
I would also think whether from the survey or from I guess this probably isn't even in the data, it has to do with one of the qualifications, but trying to get some sense of prior labor market experience, because presumably the hiring schools also have access to that information, and that may factor into their decision making, especially given the age of which these people are leaving.
So there's nothing in the state data about applications. You can get it from district to district,
or from one of your. But you can get it from one of or all of the 6 partners. I mean, I know there's a data entry issue, but it's hard to get a sense of the potential magnitude of the bias of these relationships, especially without knowing about things like prior labor market experience. And if some of, for some of the prospective teachers, I imagine they're doing primarily online courses or Ignite courses. They may be maintaining other employment, and so especially if those other employment terms are more favorable, then that may be in part why they're not hired even if they have a lot.
Yeah. So this is actually all data that we will be able to get from the state for very recent interns, because the state has started to match up the UI record.
It seems like cohort effects could also be an interesting kind of driver of who chooses to enter and who doesn't. Whether there is kind of a quorum of new student teachers in the school that you've been placed in or not, and whether that drives any of your behavior. Is that something that you guys have looked at, or
We haven't, but that's something that we could. Yeah.
So the idea there being maybe like you're interested in starting with a budget?
Yeah, that there's just kind of more of a support network. I think there's like a really small literature on first-year teachers being placed in schools together, and some positive, if not anything else, just kind of positive effects on their advocacy and their.
That makes sense to me, although it would be hard, it might also be difficult to do this with lots of new teachers.
Yeah.
But, so I was, as you're saying, I was thinking that you're probably not going to find a lot of examples where there are lots of new teachers hired into the same school, just given the size of a lot of schools. But certainly it's in the same district.
Yeah.
And you could imagine that there would be cohort effects of that relative.
Yeah, if they have any sort of organized way to, get in touch with one another, or they just kind of be in silos themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out if the student teachers who taught in a high free lunch school with a cohort, with a number of other student teachers, then had a greater tendency to go to those higher free lunch schools. So that the support, not necessarily the same school, but a school that had a similar characteristic pattern.
Yeah. I also, the other thing that we're doing downstream is to look at the teacher career path. So, what is the relationship between your student teaching experiences and your transitions over the early part of your career? And you could imagine some of these things could affect that as well.
Great, thanks, man. This is